Hello and welcome to Dialogue. 2024 is expected to be a pivotal year for China-U.S. relations, with many issues in question: the outcome of the U.S. presidential election, potential conflict points in the Asia-Pacific region, and whether the two countries can maintain good momentum after the San Francisco summit. All these issues have great consequences on bilateral ties. To address these questions, in the first part of today's show, I talk with Presnick, founder of Super 8 Hotels China. As a seasoned businessman with several decades of experience working in China and an astute scholar on China-U.S. relations, Mr. Presnick shares his insights on the world's most consequential relationship. In the second part of our show, I also talk with Jack Zhang, assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas. Join us for our discussion from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. So, Mitch, we borrowed the term post-engagement. Of course, we refer to the years, the decades before probably Trump presidency as engagement. And then we do see increasing, let's say, not really hostility, but like kind of alienation between the two countries. And then we had this San Francisco summit where the two leaders decide that they will work together to stabilize the relationship. So how do you characterize the current status of this very important relationship between China and the United States?
Well, first of all, it's very nice to be here with you, Qinduo. The relationship has moved from one of what I call engagement, where the two sides were working together with business at the centerpiece. And since 2018 or thereabouts, the beginning of a trade war and then a subsequent tech war and whatever we want to call the other relationships, we've now moved into a post-engagement relationship where business has been subsumed under an umbrella of national security by both countries, I believe. And so the relationship has fundamentally changed, but the one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the business relationship has always been at the center because it's where we have the most direct shared interests. And that is where I focus. The visit that President Xi made to San Francisco was very successful from the point of view of the American business community, and it set a very conciliatory tone, which I hope both sides will build on, and the American business community hopes that we can all build on.
Mm-hmm. So, Major, talk more about this trade relationship, trade and investment between the two countries. We know if you look at the trade number, I believe, for 2022, for example, that's about, depending on the calculation, you have some differences, but largely it's about $700 billion. That's a lot. I mean, for the two countries, that's probably too much for the two countries to decouple.
Well, that's right. I think, the idea of decoupling is fantasy. It's not a realistic way to address the relationship. And not just because of the fact that it's inadvisable from a business standpoint, which is what a lot of people like to think. The reality is both countries are so intertwined into the international economy now that if either side were to try to decouple from the other, the result is they end up isolating themselves. The United States controls basically global payments and the reserve currency that the entire world uses. China controls to a large degree manufacturing and trade. So either country trying to decouple from the other will end up bringing negative consequences on themselves. And that's why the relationship, despite the challenges, still moves forward.
I believe in the 1990s, Mitch, you came to China, and and then you spent decades in China. So tell us your story. What brought you to China, and what did you do during your stay in China?
So I arrived in China on August 8th, 1988, and it was about a 31-year stay between Beijing and Hong Kong. I've been to about 150 Chinese cities. I've traveled every part of the country. I speak and read and write Chinese. So I'm a foreigner, but I'm not an outsider. And so it gives me an interesting perspective. I can only tell you that it's been an amazing experience to be in China for all of that time, because I was able to experience the entirety of China's development, and also the entirety of watching the U.S.-China relationship blossom into something that was quite extraordinary to watch, and quite beneficial in so many ways for both countries.
On the San Francisco summit, the two leaders, the two presidents, agreed to work together, to manage this relationship in a skillful way. They do reach a lot of agreements. For example, the Chinese side promised to invite like 50,000 young Americans to China to study. And of course, just a couple of days ago, I think this week, the Chinese side has said they are going to resume as much as possible the direct flights between China and the United States. I think that will be helpful for tourists and also for business people, obviously. And so, of course, it's very extensive. A lot of agreements on different areas. Are we going to see, say, a faithful implementation, a good implementation of those agreements, given, or in another way, will the election in any way affect the implementation of those agreements?
No, I think that those agreements, there was a broad agreement that there was a need to bring down the temperature a little bit. I think that was something that everybody thought would be helpful. It's important to look back on the history of the U.S.-China relationship and remember that it started with ping pong diplomacy. And I still have a ping pong paddle signed by Dr. Kissinger at the 30th anniversary of ping pong diplomacy at Diaoyutai he gave me. And I look at it sometimes to remind myself that this relationship began with very humble and small exchanges where we could agree on something. And if we couldn't agree on anything else, at least we could agree on ping pong. And I think right now it's not a bad way to go forward. Let's agree on students going over to China. Let's agree on pandas coming back to the U.S. Let's agree on little things that we can build upon and feel good about, and then move forward from there, because that's a great way to create some stability. And I think that's an obligation, frankly, that both countries have to the world, because there's no way that the world can feel safe and secure if the U.S.-China relationship isn't stable and secure. And that's something that I think it's a responsibility when you're a great power like China and like the U.S. It's a great responsibility to look at the needs of the entire world and not just our own needs. And I think these are the kinds of things that can be very helpful for that.
Mm-hmm. Where at least they should be able to agree with each other on that. That's the both leaders have demonstrated that is not only by the two countries but also the rest of the world. Speak of these people-to-people exchanges, Mitch, the importance. I think a lot of people understand that. That's the foundation for bilateral relationship. I talked to a U.S. professor actually. He mentioned this to me. Like this travel advisory on the website of the State Department, it remains unchanged from a year earlier. Basically, warns against or cautions, the Americans, to be careful if you go to China. And also the Chinese side just this week that has, basically saying the U.S. authorities blocking the Chinese students at the border, saying dozens of Chinese nationals are being denied entry to the U.S. each month. Dozens of cases. So this is after San Francisco summit. So do we know the Biden administration, what's the policy in terms of people-to-people exchange?
That's a great question, Jindwa. I'm not actually sure exactly what the policy is. First of all, whenever you have an agreement like this, there is an implementation period. There is a period of, digestion where everybody needs to understand the new policies and understand how to move forward. So it could very well just be a case that things move a little slower within the halls of government than they do, say, in business. If it was a business agreement, we would probably be seeing the immediate changes. It's hard to say if it's one case or the other in the case of some of those issues you mentioned. I can tell you that it is regrettable to see some of that happening. I was just in China in late November. I know many of my fellow American, China specialists have also been to China in the last 6 months. I don't think any of us felt unsafe in any way. I think, I personally felt it was extremely similar to all the 30 years I had been there previously. Although I will say, it's incredibly efficient now moving around in Beijing and other cities in China compared to even 10 years ago, just given how much China has moved forward on automation and some of these things. But back to your question, I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens here. I don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows exactly, why that we haven't seen some of those agreements implemented yet, but I think it's very possible it just might take a little more time. And I also think that, remember, relationships this important and this big, when they move in a direction, there's momentum behind it, and that momentum is also an inertia. And so in whatever we think is happening, we don't necessarily know the inertia involved in moving a relationship and turning it over, even if it's only a few degrees one way or the other.
When we talk about this China-U.S. relationship, because it encompasses so many aspects, there's enormous discussion on this relationship. You tweeted not long ago that when discussing, here's a quote, U.S.-China relations now, we need serious cost-benefit analysis with expected outcomes based on historical successes and failures. Not more of this hawks and doves stuff. We are not just apes fighting over territory any longer. This is the age of the fourth industrial revolution, and we either evolve or die. Tell us more about that.
Well, the reason I'm here at Harvard is because I believe, since I know pretty much everybody involved in the U.S.-China relationship from both sides, I've noticed that the times we're living in, we live in a time of hyperconnectivity and evolutionary technology, exponential technology. And yet the dialogue around our relationship is still very much rooted in old world thinking. It's very much zero-sum, scarcity mindset, and frankly, nationalism, which has served everybody well for many millennia, is now starting to show that it may not be the most appropriate way to deal with relations between great powers. So there is a bit of a gap that I'm starting to see between the evolution of our thinking and the evolution of our technology. And I believe that our thinking in terms of how countries work with one another needs to evolve as well. I think we need to move beyond coupling and decoupling and beyond zero-sum to positive-sum thinking. And we need to understand that, look, the U.S.-China relationship, it's easy to look at things from the point of view of I'm Chinese and I'm looking at this relationship, or I'm American and I'm looking at this relationship. But we need to understand that the U.S. and China are now two parts of a symbiotic pair. And that symbiotic pair means that whatever the U.S. does, good or bad in the eyes of the Chinese, it will eventually have repercussions back in the U.S. And the same for China. Whatever China does in this relationship, it affects the U.S., which then affects China. So whether it's voluntary or not, the two sides are very much symbiotic, and the relationship needs to be viewed at least partly through a symbiotic lens. And we would need to ask ourselves, what if aliens came down in a spaceship and started to talk to us? they would not be looking at us in terms of Chinese and Americans. They would be looking at us in terms of sapiens, and they would be dealing with us as one species. It wouldn't make any sense for them to think, well, this species part over here are different from this species part over here. They would think that was quite primitive. And I think that as we move forward with our technology, I'm starting to think that it looks a little primitive. And yes, I understand the reasons behind it, and I'm not unrealistic. If anything, I'm very much in the realist camp on the U.S.-China relationship. I've never had any illusions about where we have common ground and where we have differences. But I believe that we need to focus a little bit more together on issues of common concern, because things like climate change just simply won't be addressed without the U.S. and China cooperating. There's just no scenario where the U.S. does everything it can to turn around climate change, but China doesn't, for example, because then American businesses and even the American population would say, well, the Chinese aren't cooperating with us, so why should we do this? And then and the same is in reverse. If China were to do things to try to improve climate change and didn't see the U.S. Following suit, then the Chinese side would clearly say, well, this is a waste of time. But more important is that the rest of the world, the 200 nations around the world that we share this earth with, would also say, why should we do anything if these guys aren't cooperating? So I think when it comes to issues like public health and climate change and even AI, I think that the two countries are far more likely to help themselves by ring fencing some of those areas of common interest and focusing on them together, regardless of what's happening in the rest of the relationship.
To discuss more on the latest in China-U.S. relations, I talk with Jack Zhang, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Kansas. He was selected as a China specialist by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and has conducted extensive research regarding U.S. trade policy toward China. Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Zhang.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's some time since the summit between the two national leaders. When they met in San Francisco, it was a very successful one. So what about the follow-up actions from both sides?
Yeah, so I really welcome the efforts made at the San Francisco APEC summit to stabilize U.S.-China relations and prevent a further deterioration of the relationship. I know both sides worked really hard to make that meeting happen in a relatively short period of time. I think we're already seeing some of the commitments being turned into concrete actions. The mill-to-mill dialogues have resumed. Cooperation on fentanyl is deepening. There was coordination ahead of COP28 in decreasing greenhouse emissions. But I think if you expect a reversal or a change in direction or a reset of U.S. policy towards China, or any cooperation sort of beyond the letter of the agreement, I think the White House statement readout was very clear in outlining that it's about managing competition, right? Not suspending that competition. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that there's going to be much of a change in the broad directions or in additional sort of areas of cooperation beyond what is specifically spelled out in that agreement.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the trade issue, the U.S., as we said earlier, the U.S. is not changing its policy on China despite the agreements, between the two leaders. So the U.S. is still following a general policy. People would describe that, high-tech containment and then economic pressure on China. So the Biden administration has maintained the controversial tariffs, for example. That's probably one area we are not seeing clear changes yet. And also the administration is even considering, imposing higher tariffs on Chinese EVs, electric vehicles, and minerals like cobalt and lithium. What do you make of this possible policy out of the White House?
Right. I was very disappointed that there was not more progress on the rolling back of tariffs under this administration, because I think it is an area in which both the U.S. and China could benefit. I have a student of mine wrote a very, I think, insightful essay for the China Focus Essay Contest on what he calls green protectionism, right? And this is the idea that there's difficult trade-offs between conflicting objectives like accelerating the green energy transition on the one hand, and putting tariffs on renewable energy so that to favor U.S. competitors, or to keep Chinese products out of the United States. The Biden administration, I think, believes that it can do both of these things, right? That it can have a green revolution, green policy, and also not rely on Chinese imports. And politically, I think that idea is attractive, right? That you can have jobs here in the U.S. For these industries, and it's helping with competition with China in some ways. I think the problem is that it ignores the reality of economic trade-offs, right? That China is the market leader on providing a lot of these goods at competitive prices, including a lot of green technology, as you mentioned in the question, right? EVs, wind, solar panels, right? This issue kind of goes back even, back to the Obama administration, right? And so it's doable to produce these things in the United States, but the question is, how much longer will that take, right? And how much more expensive will that be?
If you look at the numbers, for example, China-U.S., they used to be the largest or close to the largest trading partner of each other. But in last year, for example, from January to October, the first 10 months, what we see is there's a decrease by 7.6% on trade, on the total value of trade between the two countries. First of all, what are the factors you think they are contributing to this decrease? So decoupling efforts from the U.S., I guess, from what I see, and importantly, does this indicate a downward trend here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and tariffs are having an effect, right? Tariffs are taxes on imports, and so the U.S. used to have average tariff rate about 3% on Chinese goods, similar to the rest of the world. And now average tariffs on Chinese imports are at about 20%. That's a sevenfold increase. And they're still at 3% for everyone else. And so that means if there is an alternative that used to be more expensive, products made outside of China, now if it's within that 20% tariff margin, now it's competitive in terms of price, right? I think that the challenging thing to realize, and I think policymakers in the U.S. often neglect this point, is that in an era of economic globalization, economic nationalism is a double-edged sword, right? Tariffs don't hurt just Chinese companies. Tariffs on China doesn't hurt just Chinese companies, and they are not necessarily good at keeping out Chinese products, right? So foreign companies that manufacture in China and export to the U.S. are also affected by tariffs. American companies that import important components and do manufacturing here are impacted by those tariffs. And most interesting trend recently is that Chinese companies can move somewhere else, right, to do manufacturing, and that Chinese company can export goods from the U.S., let's say from Mexico or from Vietnam, and that's not a Chinese import by the way that we do trade accounting. And so firms are mobile, and they're going to adjust their business practices to the reality of tariffs. And so in the meantime, right, American consumers and businesses are paying sort of higher prices as well on the margins to deal with this.
For two countries like China and the U.S., they are so interdependent in terms of trade and economy, but still we do see a lot of, say, economic or even military coercive actions or measures against each other. Give us some examples in how, in what way they're, probably one country is doing to the other.
Politically and economically, I think we're at a low point, right, of the relationship, is what Henry Kissinger calls the foothills of a new Cold War. a lot of that, I think, is driven by this dynamic of the security dilemma, really unleashed by the trade war, as I see it, right? So from the U.S. side, or even going beyond that, right? The Made in China 2025 policy was a major driver for why the Section 301 tariffs were put into place in the first place. And I think a lot of Chinese analysts would say, well, the Made in China 2025 and indigenous innovation in general is about catching up because China was so far behind on technology and so forth. Well, from the U.S. side, that was seen as industrial policy that is giving an unfair advantage to Chinese companies in some sectors, and pushing out U.S. companies in important industries, right? So the tariffs came into place. Important to remember, the tariffs were supported by major chambers, right? Usually, friendly to China, but supported the Section 301 findings, at least the investigations. Maybe not the tariffs themselves, but so that's why we ended up with the tariffs. Though we have retaliatory tariffs, right, that are seen as again defensive, responding to this, but that hurts U.S. farmers, and so the cycle just continues, right? So unfortunately, right, and I know many in China believe that the U.S. is intent on economic containment. I happen to think, some people feel that way. I don't actually think that is the administration has been clear. The Biden administration is clear that that's not its intention. I tend to believe them, right? But the problem is when you're in this kind of a security dilemma, it doesn't really matter, right? As long as your actions are perceived as threatening by the other side and they respond, and those responses are then seen as escalatory, we end up in this destabilizing spiral where, unfortunately, I think miscalculation can happen, right? I believe the trade war was a miscalculation. I think both sides went into it with the initial escalation of tariffs, believing the other side would back down, believing that they understood how the other side's domestic politics were going to play out. They were wrong, and now we're stuck with this unfortunate kind of equilibrium, right? I call it a war of attrition, right? The trade war is still grinding on, but people have stopped paying attention, to it. No longer top of the political agenda for I think either country. It's really unfortunate, right? Again, it goes back to this idea of it's easier to break things, I think, is what we learned in the last 5 years than to build them. And so maybe we should be careful, both sides, to halt the further deterioration of the relationship.
On that note, we are coming to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.